The story of World War II does not begin with gunfire or bombs or armies clashing in the fields. It begins in silence, in the uneasy quiet of a world still scarred from the last Great War. The year is 1919. The First World War has ended. Millions lie buried in the soil of Europe. Cities are in ruins. Families mourn. The victors gather at Versailles to sign a treaty they believe will bring peace. But the peace is fragile, heavy with resentment, heavy with punishment, heavy with seeds that will one day grow into new conflict. For 20 years, the world lives in the shadow of that war. The guns are quiet, but beneath the surface, storms are building, and it is here, in this silence, that the disturbing story of World War II truly begins. The Treaty of Versailles was meant to end all wars, but for Germany, it felt like a wound that would not heal. Germany was forced to give up territory. Its army was reduced to a fraction of its former strength. Heavy reparations were demanded, billions in payments that drained the economy. Worst of all, Germany was forced to accept the war guilt clause, admitting full responsibility for the conflict. To the victorious nations, this was justice. To the German people, it was humiliation. Pride was broken, anger smoldered, and out of that anger, darker voices began to whisper. The 1920s brought more turmoil. The world economy stumbled. In 1929, the Great Depression spread like a shadow across nations. Banks collapsed, factories closed, millions lost jobs. In Germany, despair deepened. Bread lines stretched through city streets. Children went hungry. Families burned worthless banknotes for warmth because the paper was cheaper than firewood. Inflation rose until wages could not keep pace. People longed for stability, for order, for someone strong enough to restore pride and bring back certainty. It was in this climate that Adolf Hitler, once a failed artist and soldier, found his moment. Germany was not alone. Across Europe and beyond, strong men rose to power in the void left by chaos. In Italy, Benito Mussolini declared himself the Duce, the leader. His black shirts marched through Rome, promising discipline, unity, and a return to greatness. He wrapped himself in the symbols of ancient Rome, but beneath the pageantry lay violence, censorship, and control. In Japan, military leaders gained influence. They looked to expand into Asia, to seize resources and land. Their eyes turned to China, their ambitions stretching far beyond their islands. In Germany, the Nazi Party grew. Hitler's speeches stirred crowds with promises to restore pride, to tear up Versailles, to rebuild the army. He spoke of a 1,000-year Reich, a new empire. His words were dangerous, but to a broken people, they sounded like hope. The 1930s brought warning signs, each one a tremor before the quake. In 1931, Japan invaded Manchuria, testing the resolve of the League of Nations. The world protested, but nothing was done. In 1935, Mussolini invaded Ethiopia, unleashing poison gas on soldiers armed with spears. Again, the world protested, but again, nothing was done. In 1936, Hitler sent troops into the Rhineland, a region forbidden by Versailles. German soldiers marched, bayonets gleaming, while French and British leaders hesitated. They feared another war, and so they did nothing. Each time, aggression was met with silence. Each silence encouraged the next step. In 1936, Spain became a testing ground for what was to come. A brutal civil war broke out between left-wing Republicans and right-wing nationalists. led by Francisco Franco. Germany and Italy sent planes, tanks, and soldiers to aid Franco. Bombs fell on Spanish towns. One such town, Guernica, was destroyed in a terrifying air raid, the first of its kind. Civilians were slaughtered from the sky. The world watched in horror, but still, the great powers did not intervene. The shadows deepened. By 1938, Hitler's ambitions were clear. He annexed Austria in what he called the Anschluss. Crowds cheered in Vienna as German troops entered, but not everyone cheered. Jews were beaten in the streets, businesses destroyed, synagogues burned. Next came Czechoslovakia. Hitler demanded the Sudetenland, claiming it was rightfully German. At Munich, leaders of Britain and France met him, desperate to avoid conflict. They gave him what he wanted, believing they had preserved peace. But the peace was a lie. Hitler was not satisfied. He never would be. By 1939, the world stood on the edge. Alliances shifted, armies mobilized, nerves frayed. Then came the shocking news. Germany and the Soviet Union had signed a pact, promising not to fight each other, secretly agreeing to divide Poland between them. It was the final shadow. The storm was ready to break. The date is September 1st, 1939. Dawn breaks over Europe. In the gray light of morning, German tanks roll across the Polish border. Planes roar overhead. Soldiers march in tight columns. It is the beginning of a storm that will sweep across the world. The invasion of Poland has begun. For years, Hitler had promised peace, even as he seized Austria and the Sudetenland. But now the mask is gone. The promises are broken. The Third Reich is on the move. The German attack is swift, brutal, and unlike anything the world has seen before. They call it blitzkrieg, lightning war. Planes bomb railways, bridges, and cities, cutting supply lines before Poland can respond. Tanks roll fast across the plains, bypassing strong points, sowing confusion. Motorized infantry follow, sealing the trap. Within days, Poland is collapsing. Its army fights bravely, but they are overwhelmed by speed, by coordination, by sheer force. Wars in the past had dragged slowly, bogged down, in trenches. But this war is different. It moves like a storm across the land. On September 3rd, 1939, 2 days after the invasion, Britain and France declare war on Germany. Across Europe, church bells ring. In London, people gather around radios as Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain speaks in somber tones. This country is at war with Germany. The words fall heavy. Another war, just 20 years after the last one. Another war that no one truly wanted, but no one could avoid. Crowds are quiet, faces pale. Memories of the First World War are fresh. Millions had died then. How many more will die now? On September 17th, a second blow falls. From the east, the Soviet Union invades Poland. Bound by their secret pact with Germany, they seize their share of the country. Poland is crushed between two giants. By the end of the month, Warsaw falls. The nation is divided. The war that began with Poland will not end with it. It has only just begun. And then, unexpectedly, there is silence. For months after the fall of Poland, Europe waits. On the Western Front, French and British soldiers sit in trenches behind them, Maginot Line. German troops stand opposite, watching. Little happens. No great battles. No major offensives. Newspapers call it the phony war. But beneath the stillness, preparations are underway. Armies train. Weapons are built. Plans are drawn. It is a quiet that feels uneasy, like the air before a thunderstorm. Everyone knows the lightning will strike again. In April 1940, the silence ends. German forces move north, seizing Denmark in a single day. Norway follows soon after. German paratroopers drop from the skies. Warships attack from the sea. The Allies attempt to intervene, but they are too slow, too unprepared. Norway falls. The world realizes that blitzkrieg can strike anywhere, anytime. Then, in May 1940, the real storm begins. German forces launch an invasion of France and the Low Countries. Once again, blitzkrieg is unleashed. The French expect the attack to come through Belgium, as it had in the First World War. They prepare there, confident in the massive Maginot Line, a wall of fortifications along the German border. But Hitler surprises them. German tanks push through the Ardennes, a forest thought impassable. They break through with speed and ferocity, cutting deep behind Allied lines. The British and French armies are caught off guard. Panic spreads. The line collapses. By late May, British and French forces are trapped at the port city of Dunkirk. Surrounded, pressed against the sea, they face annihilation. But then comes a desperate rescue. The British Navy, joined by hundreds of civilian boats, fishing vessels, ferries, even pleasure yachts, cross the channel to bring the soldiers home. Under constant attack from the air, over 330,000 men are evacuated. It is called the Miracle of Dunkirk, a narrow escape. But France itself cannot be saved. On June 14, 1940, German troops march into Paris. The city is declared open to avoid destruction. The Eiffel Tower stands silent as soldiers march beneath it. Within weeks, France surrenders. Europe is stunned. France, one of the great powers, defeated in just 6 weeks. Germany now dominates the continent. With France fallen, only Britain remains. Across the Channel, Hitler prepares for invasion. Plans are drawn for Operation Sea Lion, the conquest of the island nation. But to cross the sea, Germany must first control the air. And so begins the next chapter, the Battle of Britain. The summer of 1940 was warm in England. Fields of wheat swayed in the breeze. Children played in quiet villages. Church bells rang across the countryside. But above that peace, in the clear blue sky, engines began to growl. The war had crossed the Channel. For the first time, Britain stood alone. France was gone. Europe lay under Hitler's control. Only the island resisted, and Hitler believed he could break it. To conquer Britain, he needed to cross the sea. But the sea could not be crossed until the skies were his. And so began the Battle of Britain, a war not of trenches or tanks, but of wings and propellers, fought high in the clouds. Germany sent its air force, the Luftwaffe, in vast numbers. Fighters, bombers, dive bombers. They were confident. They had swept across Poland, Norway, France. They believed Britain would fall quickly, just as the others had. Their plan was simple: destroy the Royal Air Force on the ground, bomb airfields, radar stations, aircraft factories, crush Britain's ability to fight back. Once the skies were clear, the invasion would begin. Soldiers would cross the Channel in barges, supported by bombers overhead. It seemed inevitable, but the British were not defenseless. The Royal Air Force was smaller, fewer in number, but well prepared. Their fighters, the Hawker Hurricane and the sleek Supermarine Spitfire, were fast, agile, deadly in skilled hands. More importantly, Britain had something new: radar. Towers lined the coast, sweeping the skies with invisible beams, detecting enemy planes long before they arrived. Pilots could be scrambled in time to meet them, saving precious minutes. It was a quiet, unseen advantage, one that would help turn the tide. In July 1940, the German bombers came. Waves of aircraft crossed the channel, engines droning, wings glinting in the sun. They struck at shipping in the channel, probing Britain's defenses. Soon, the raids intensified. Airfields in southern England were bombed. Runways cratered. Hangars burned. Pilots scrambled again and again, sometimes flying 4 or 5 missions a day. The skies filled with twisting dogfights, planes diving, spiraling, machine guns flashing. Contrails scratched across the blue, marking the paths of battle. And below, civilians watched in silence as the war raged above their homes. By August, the assault grew heavier. German bombers struck deep, targeting radar towers, fuel depots, aircraft factories. The RAF was stretched thin. Pilots were exhausted. Some slept beside their planes, waking only to scramble again. Losses mounted. Young men barely out of training were thrown into battle. Many never returned. The average life expectancy of a new pilot was just a few weeks. But still, the RAF held. They were outnumbered, but never outflown. In September, a mistake changed everything. A German bomber aiming for military targets dropped its bombs on London by accident. In retaliation, Britain bombed Berlin. Hitler was enraged. He ordered the Luftwaffe to shift focus away from airfields and onto cities. The Blitz began. Night after night, London burned. Firestorms swept through neighborhoods. Families huddled in underground stations, listening to bombs whistle and crash above them. The sky glowed red with flame. The suffering was immense, but the shift gave the RAF a chance to recover, to repair airfields, to rebuild strength. The battle reached its height in mid-September. Hundreds of German bombers and fighters poured across the channel, met by swarms of British planes. The skies thundered with engines and gunfire. On September 15th, the RAF fought one of its fiercest days, shooting down scores of enemy planes. The invasion plans faltered. Hitler postponed Operation Sea Lion indefinitely. Britain had survived. In London, Prime Minister Winston Churchill spoke to Parliament. His words still echo. Never in the field of human conflict was so much owed by so many to so few. Victory was not without loss. Over 40,000 civilians were killed in the Blitz. Whole neighborhoods reduced to rubble. Children evacuated to the countryside. Families torn apart. For the pilots, the strain was unimaginable. Exhaustion, trauma, grief. Many never spoke of what they saw, even decades later. The disturbing truth is that survival came not through invincibility, but through endurance. Britain bent, but did not break. The year is 1941. Europe has fallen. France is occupied. Britain still stands, but isolated. Across the continent, Nazi banners hang from city halls, and Hitler appears unstoppable. But in his mind, victory is not yet complete. For beyond the forests and rivers of Eastern Europe lies a prize greater than all the rest, the Soviet Union. Its vast land stretches from the Baltic to the Pacific. Its fields hold grain. Its soil hides oil, coal, and minerals. To Hitler, it is more than territory. It is destiny, a new empire carved from the east where Germany would rule forever. And so, in June 1941, he unleashes his boldest and most disastrous gamble, Operation Barbarossa, the invasion of the Soviet Union. On the morning of June 22, 1941, the German war machine moves east, 3 million soldiers, thousands of tanks, Luftwaffe squadrons roaring overhead. It is the largest invasion in the history of the world. The Soviet border defenses crumble under the onslaught. Entire divisions are encircled. Towns fall in days. The Wehrmacht advances hundreds of miles in weeks. The Red Army is caught unprepared, disorganized, shocked. Hitler believes victory will be swift. He promises his generals that the campaign will end in a few months. By winter, he claims, the Soviet Union will be gone. But he is wrong. One of the first great targets is Leningrad, the city of the Tsars, now home to millions. German forces encircle it, cutting off supplies. What follows is one of the longest and most harrowing sieges in history. For 872 days, Leningrad is starved. Bread rations shrink to crumbs. People boil wallpaper paste for food. Pets vanish. Stories circulate of darker measures, whispered in desperation. Winter freezes the city. Corpses line the streets. And yet, the city does not fall. Somehow, through unimaginable suffering, the people endure. Meanwhile, German armies push toward Moscow, the heart of the Soviet Union. Villages burn, refugees flee eastward, soldiers fight desperate rearguard actions. By October, German tanks are within sight of the city. Moscow trembles, government offices evacuate, but the city does not surrender. Soviet reinforcements arrive, many brought from the Far East, hardened troops accustomed to winter. And then the snow falls. The German advance stalls in the bitter Russian winter. Snow drifts high. Temperatures plunge below minus 30 degrees Celsius. Engines freeze. Soldiers shiver in summer uniforms. Guns jam in the cold. Horses die in the snow. The Wehrmacht, unstoppable in summer, is paralyzed in winter. And the Red Army strikes back. In December, Soviet counterattacks push the Germans away from Moscow. The dream of a quick victory is shattered. The war in the East is not like the wars before. It is not just armies clashing. It is total war, with civilians caught in the middle. Villages are burned, populations executed. Entire communities of Jews are rounded up and massacred by mobile killing squads known as Einsatzgruppen. Men, women, and children shot into pits. The brutality is staggering. Millions die not only from bullets, but from starvation, disease, and forced labor. The Eastern Front becomes a place of suffering beyond imagination. Though the Germans push far into Soviet lands, victory slips further from their grasp. By 1942, Hitler sets his sights on a new target, Stalingrad, the city on the Volga, bearing the name of his enemy, Joseph Stalin. It will become the turning point of the entire war. But that is a story for another night. Operation Barbarossa was meant to be a triumph. Instead, it became the graveyard of Hitler's ambitions. The largest invasion in history turned into one of the greatest disasters. The disturbing truth is that millions died in the attempt. Soldiers frozen in the snow. Civilians starved behind sieges. Entire peoples exterminated. The scale of suffering is almost impossible to grasp. Hooray! While Europe burned, far across the oceans, another empire was rising. An empire of islands, mountains, and ambition. Japan. For decades, Japan had transformed itself from a secluded nation into a modern power. Its navy was strong, its industry growing, its leaders determined to claim their place among the great nations. But to them, the Pacific was not wide enough. They hungered for land, for resources, for empire. And so, while Hitler marched across Europe, Japan turned its eyes toward Asia and the seas beyond. In 1931, Japan invaded Manchuria, carving out a puppet state they called Manchukuo. In 1937, they struck deeper into China, capturing cities like Nanjing, where atrocities shocked the world. Tens of thousands killed, civilians brutalized. Still, the world did little. Just as Germany had tested Europe, Japan tested Asia and found little resistance. But Japan's leaders wanted more. They dreamed of a greater East Asia co-prosperity sphere, a vast empire stretching across the Pacific, rich in oil, rubber, and metals. There was only one obstacle: the United States. The U.S. had not yet entered the war, but it watched Japan closely. America controlled the Philippines, Guam, and other islands in the Pacific. It also supplied Japan with vital oil. When Japan invaded French Indochina in 1940, America responded with sanctions, cutting off supplies of oil and steel. Without them, Japan's war machine would grind to a halt. Japan faced a choice: pull back or strike. They chose to strike. On the morning of December 7th, 1941, the calm waters of Pearl Harbor, Hawaii, shimmered in the sun. Battleships lay at anchor. Sailors still slept. The base was peaceful. Then, just before 8 a.m., the sky roared with engines. Japanese planes swooped low, dropping bombs and torpedoes. Explosions ripped through the harbor. The battleship Arizona erupted in flame, sinking with over 1,000 men aboard. The Oklahoma capsized. Smoke rose in dark columns, blotting out the sky. The attack lasted less than 2 hours. By the end, over 2,400 Americans were dead. The U.S. Pacific Fleet lay crippled. The next day, President Franklin D. Roosevelt addressed Congress, his voice calm, deliberate. December 7th, 1941, a date which will live in infamy. The United States declared war on Japan. Days later, Germany and Italy declared war on America. The conflict was now truly global. In the months after Pearl Harbor, Japan surged across the Pacific like a tidal wave. They captured Hong Kong, Malaya, Singapore, the so-called Gibraltar of the East. They swept into the Philippines, where American and Filipino troops were forced into the brutal Bataan Death March. Burma, Indonesia, the Dutch East Indies all fell. Japan seemed unstoppable, its empire spreading from the shores of India to the edges of Australia. But like Germany, Japan had overreached. In June 1942, Japanese forces struck toward Midway Island, hoping to draw out and destroy the U.S. Navy. But American codebreakers had learned their plans. The U.S. Navy prepared an ambush. Over 3 days, aircraft carriers launched waves of planes across the sea. Bombs struck Japanese carriers, one after another, turning decks into infernos. By the battle's end, Japan had lost 4 carriers, the heart of its fleet. Midway was a turning point. From then on, Japan would fight on the defensive, its empire shrinking under relentless pressure. The Pacific War became a slow, grinding struggle. Allied forces advanced island by island in brutal campaigns across jungles and beaches. At Guadalcanal, U.S. Marines fought for months, enduring disease, hunger, and fierce resistance. At Iwo Jima, soldiers raised the American flag on Mount Suribachi. after one of the bloodiest battles of the war. At Okinawa, civilians were caught in the crossfire, tens of thousands dying as the island was torn apart. Each step forward brought the Allies closer to Japan itself. But the cost in lives was staggering. The Pacific War was not just ships and planes. It was civilians starved in occupied lands, prisoners of war beaten, forced into labor, sent to death on brutal marches, kamikaze pilots, young men ordered to crash their planes into ships, sacrificing themselves in desperate final acts. The ocean was vast. The battles were relentless. The suffering was immense. Wars are not only fought on battlefields, they are also fought in kitchens, in schools, in silent streets, and in the hearts of ordinary people. As German armies swept across Europe, entire nations found themselves under occupation. France, Belgium, Norway, Poland, Greece, one by one, their governments collapsed, their flags lowered, and the swastika raised in their place. For those who lived there, life changed overnight. The war was no longer something distant. It was in their homes, their markets, their daily bread. Occupation was not just military control. It was psychological. Posters covered walls, declaring new rules. Radios were censored, newspapers rewritten. Soldiers patrolled streets with rifles slung over their shoulders. Curfews were imposed. Identity papers checked. The sound of boots echoed on cobblestones. Fear hung heavy in the air. For some, life went on in muted rhythm. Children went to school, shops opened, trains ran. But beneath the surface, everything was different. Every word, every glance, every action was watched. Food was scarce. Ration cards dictated how much bread, meat, or sugar a family could buy. Queues stretched for blocks outside bakeries. Black markets flourished, where desperate people traded whatever they had for extra flour, oil, or coffee. In cities like Warsaw and Paris, hunger became a constant companion. People grew thinner, meals grew smaller. Empty shelves reminded everyone of the war, even when the guns were far away. And in the East, the suffering was worse still. In occupied Soviet lands, entire villages were stripped of food. Starvation became a weapon. Not everyone accepted occupation quietly. Across Europe, resistance movements grew. Some were small, printing secret newspapers, painting slogans on walls, smuggling food to those in hiding. Others grew bolder, sabotaging rail lines, ambushing patrols, gathering intelligence for the Allies. In France, the Maquis fought from the forests. Their lives lived in constant danger. In Poland, underground schools and theaters preserved culture even as Nazi rule tried to erase it. In Norway, saboteurs destroyed heavy water plants, hindering Germany's atomic ambitions. Resistance was dangerous. Capture meant imprisonment, torture, or death. And yet, people resisted still. Fear was enforced by shadow. The Gestapo, the secret police, spread terror wherever they went. Neighbors could not be trusted. A careless word overheard could lead to arrest. Families disappeared in the night, their doors left swinging open, their names erased. Whispers carried danger. Silence became survival. In occupied cities, the greatest weapon was fear itself. For Jewish communities, occupation was even more terrible. Ghettos were created, walled-off districts where families were crammed into tiny apartments, cut off from the outside world. Hunger, disease, and despair spread. From these ghettos, deportations began. Trains carried people away, families torn apart. Most never returned. The disturbing reality of the Holocaust grew in these occupied lands. Hidden at first, then undeniable. And yet, even in the darkest times, life went on. Children still laughed, though their laughter was softer. Weddings were held, though without feast or music. Birthdays were celebrated with scraps of sugar, tiny cakes baked in secret. Ordinary people clung to small rituals of humanity. A loaf of bread shared with a neighbor, a song hummed in the dark, a whispered prayer before sleep. These quiet acts became small rebellions, proof that even under occupation, the human spirit endured. Not everyone resisted. Some collaborated, whether out of fear, necessity, or ambition. Local officials enforced German orders. Businesses profited by supplying the occupiers. Some saw opportunity where others saw only suffering. Occupation blurred the line between guilt and survival. To resist could mean death. To cooperate could mean living another day. Choices were rarely simple. They were gray, heavy, and haunting. For years, the Axis powers had seemed unstoppable. Germany swept through Europe. Japan stormed across the Pacific. Italy pushed into Africa. Everywhere, their banners flew. But by 1942 and 1943, the tide began to shift, slowly at first. Then, with gathering strength, the Allies pushed back. In the deserts of North Africa, in the frozen ruins of Stalingrad, and across the wide Pacific, the storm began to turn. In the North African desert, the war played out in sand and heat. German General Erwin Rommel, the Desert Fox, led the Afrika Korps in swift maneuvers, his tanks carving across dunes. The British, battered and retreating, fought to hold the line. But in October 1942, at a small railway stop called El Alamein, they made their stand. British General Bernard Montgomery gathered his forces, tanks, artillery, infantry. For 12 days, under blazing sun and choking dust, the battle raged. The night skies lit with tracer fire. The desert thundered with shells. At last, Rommel's forces broke. The Allies advanced, chasing the Axis westward across Libya. Winston Churchill declared, "Before Alamein, we never had a victory. After Alamein, we never had a defeat." It was a turning point. North Africa would be the first front where the Axis was rolled back. Far to the east, on the banks of the Volga River, another battle raged. The city of Stalingrad, a vast industrial hub bearing the name of the Soviet leader himself, became the focus of Hitler's ambition. In the summer of 1942, German armies reached the city. They expected another swift conquest. Instead, they found a nightmare. Street by street, house by house, room by room, Soviet defenders fought with desperation. Snipers hid in ruins. Soldiers battled with knives and bayonets in collapsed buildings. Civilians dug trenches, carried water, endured the bombs. The city became a graveyard of steel and stone. By winter, German troops were trapped in the ruins, surrounded by Soviet armies. Supplies ran out. The cold was merciless. On February 2nd, 1943, the last German forces surrendered. Nearly 300,000 Axis soldiers had been destroyed. The myth of German invincibility was shattered. Stalingrad was more than a battle. It was a turning of history. In the Pacific, the tide turned on the open sea. At Midway, in June 1942, the Japanese Navy sought to crush American carriers. Instead, their plans were discovered. In a series of tense, decisive strikes, U.S. dive bombers destroyed 4 Japanese carriers. In minutes, Japan's naval power was crippled. From that moment, Japan fought a defensive war. The Allies began their Long Island hopping campaign, pushing slowly toward the Japanese homeland. In July 1943, Allied forces invaded Sicily, and soon after, the Italian mainland. Mussolini's regime crumbled. Italy surrendered, though German troops fought on fiercely in the mountains. For the first time, one of the Axis powers had fallen. The noose around Hitler's empire tightened. These victories came at a price. At Stalingrad, millions, soldiers and civilians alike, died in the ruins. At El Alamein, the desert was littered with wrecks and graves. In the Pacific, jungles and reefs were soaked in blood. The tide had turned, but it was red with sacrifice. By 1944, the tide of war had shifted. The Allies were winning in North Africa. Italy had fallen. The Soviet Union was pushing westward through the ruins of the Eastern Front. But one obstacle remained. Western Europe was still under Hitler's control. France, Belgium, the Netherlands, all were occupied. To defeat Nazi Germany once and for all, the Allies would need to return to the continent. It would mean the largest seaborne invasion in history. A gamble unlike any other. An operation known simply as D-Day. For months, the Allies planned in secrecy. Soldiers trained on British beaches, practicing landings again and again. Engineers built artificial harbors in secret, ready to be floated across the channel. Paratroopers rehearsed night drops, leaping from planes into dark fields. The deception was immense. Fake armies were created. Inflatable tanks and wooden planes lined up in fields. Radio chatter filled the air. The Germans were led to believe the attack would come at Calais, not Normandy. Every detail mattered. Weather, tides, moonlight, all had to align. Thousands of ships, planes, and men waited for the signal. On the night of June 5th, 1944, as storm clouds drifted over the channel, General Dwight D. Eisenhower gave the order. Okay, let's go. Paratroopers boarded planes, their faces painted with black streaks. Sailors readied landing craft. Soldiers wrote final letters home. Some sang, some prayed. Some simply sat in silence. The invasion was set. At dawn on June 6th, 1944, the beaches of Normandy came alive with fire. Allied ships bombarded German defenses. Waves of landing craft churned through rough seas. Doors dropped, and men waded into water, rifles held high. On Omaha Beach, the resistance was fiercest. Machine guns cut across the sand. Shells exploded in the surf. Soldiers fell before they reached the shore. Yet still, wave after wave pressed on, climbing cliffs, storming bunkers, inch by inch. On other beaches, Utah, Gold, Juneau, Sword, the landings were less bloody, but no less vital. Paratroopers dropped behind enemy lines, seizing bridges and crossroads, cutting German reinforcements. By nightfall, over 150,000 Allied troops were ashore. The Atlantic Wall, Hitler's fortress, had been breached. From Normandy, the Allies pushed inland. The hedgerows of France became battlegrounds, dense, narrow fields where tanks struggled and ambushes thrived. Progress was slow, costly. But by late July, a breakout came. American forces surged forward, sweeping across the French countryside. Paris rose in revolt, and on August 25, 1944, Allied troops entered the city. Crowds wept and cheered as German forces surrendered. The City of Lights was free again. Germany, however, was not finished. In December 1944, Hitler launched one final desperate attack in the Ardennes forest. Snow blanketed the ground as German tanks smashed into thin Allied lines, creating a bulge in the front. For weeks, the battle raged in icy conditions. Towns like Bastogne became symbols of defiance, where surrounded American troops held out against overwhelming odds. At last, the attack was repelled. The Germans had spent their final strength. Their armies were broken. Their defeat was now only a matter of time. The Western Front was a path of liberation, but also of destruction. Towns were flattened, civilians killed in crossfire. Soldiers carried the weight of exhaustion, fear, and grief. For those in occupied lands, liberation was joy, mixed with sorrow. Homes destroyed, families missing. The scars of occupation and battle would remain long after the flags were raised. By the spring of 1945, the world's greatest war was reaching its final act. The Axis powers were collapsing. Italy was gone. France had been freed. The Soviets were pushing from the east, the Allies from the west. Germany's empire had shrunk to rubble. Japan's vast conquests were under siege. The war that had begun with lightning speed was ending in slow, grinding ruin. And yet, the most disturbing scenes were still to come. In April 1945, Soviet armies closed in on Berlin. The city was shattered, its streets filled with rubble, its people starving. Anti-aircraft guns pointed not to the skies, but to the tanks approaching from the east. The fighting was brutal, house by house, street by street. Soviet artillery thundered. German soldiers, old men and young boys alike, fought desperately. Civilians cowered in cellars. Fires consumed entire blocks. Deep beneath the Reich Chancellery, in a concrete bunker, Adolf Hitler remained. Surrounded by maps and dwindling aids, he raged at phantom armies that no longer existed. His empire was gone, his promises broken. On April 30th, 1945, he took his own life. 2 days later, Berlin surrendered. A week later, on May 8th, Germany's unconditional surrender was signed. The war in Europe was over. Crowds filled the streets in London, Paris, New York, Moscow, cheering, singing, embracing. But beneath the joy lay exhaustion. The war had ended, but its scars would last forever. Even as Europe celebrated, the Pacific War raged on. Japan refused to surrender. Its soldiers fought with fierce resolve, often choosing death over capture. Kamikaze pilots hurled themselves into Allied ships. Civilians suffered under bombing and starvation. The Allies prepared for invasion. Planners predicted that if they had to land on Japan's home islands, millions could die, soldiers and civilians alike. The question loomed, how to end the war quickly without an invasion that could consume even more lives. In secret, scientists had worked on a terrible new weapon, a weapon born from splitting the atom, releasing energy beyond imagination. The Manhattan Project had produced the first atomic bombs. On August 6, 1945, an American bomber flew over the city of Hiroshima. At 8:15 a.m., the bomb was released. A blinding flash lit the sky. In seconds, the city was gone. Tens of thousands killed instantly. Fires raged. Shadows of people were burned into walls. Survivors staggered through ruins, injured beyond recognition. 3 days later, a second bomb fell on Nagasaki with the same devastating force. The world had entered a new age, the atomic age. On August 15th, 1945, Emperor Hirohito spoke to his people in a radio broadcast, the first time many had ever heard his voice. His words were calm, formal, almost gentle, but their meaning was clear. Japan would surrender. On September 2nd, 1945, aboard the battleship USS Missouri in Tokyo Bay, The surrender was signed. World War II was over. The dead were counted in tens of millions. Cities lay in ashes. Empires had fallen. The world was changed forever. The war ended not in peace, but in devastation. Germany was divided. Japan was shattered. The Holocaust revealed horrors beyond imagination. Millions displaced, millions grieving, millions lost. And yet, humanity endured. From the ruins came rebuilding. From the destruction, a hope, however fragile, that such a war might never come again. The war was over. The guns were silent. The smoke cleared. And what remained was a world forever changed. Cities lay in ruins. Entire nations were broken. Families were scattered. Across Europe and Asia, survivors stepped out into the sunlight of peace and saw only rubble stretching to the horizon. The Second World War had lasted 6 years. It had taken more lives than any conflict before, and though it ended in 1945, its echoes would never truly fade. The numbers were staggering. More than 60 million people had died. Soldiers on battlefields, civilians in cities, children, the elderly, the innocent. No nation had escaped untouched. In Germany and Poland, entire towns were gone. In the Soviet Union, villages had been erased from the map. In China, millions had perished. In Japan, cities like Hiroshima and Nagasaki had been reduced to ashes. It was not only buildings that were destroyed, it was lives, families separated, never to meet again, generations lost, memories carried by the survivors as heavy burdens. As Allied soldiers liberated concentration camps, the full horror of the Holocaust was uncovered. At Auschwitz, Bergen-Belsen, Dachau, and many others, the gates swung open. Inside were emaciated survivors, skeletons in striped uniforms, staring in silence. Piles of shoes, spectacles, hair, evidence of millions murdered. The disturbing truth was undeniable. Entire communities, entire cultures had been wiped away. 6 million Jews, along with Romani people, political prisoners, disabled people, and countless others. The world stood in shock. Even now, the images remain, haunting reminders of how far cruelty can go when unchecked. In Nuremberg, Germany, the victors held trials for Nazi leaders. Crimes against humanity were named, judged, and recorded. Men who once ruled empires now stood in the dock, facing justice. It was imperfect. Not all were tried. Not all were punished. But it was a beginning, a recognition that war crimes, genocide, and inhumanity must not go unanswered. From the ruins, a new order emerged. The United Nations was created, born from the hope that nations might find peace through dialogue, not war. But peace was fragile. Tensions grew between the Soviet Union and the United States. The Cold War began, a new struggle of ideologies, shadows, and nuclear fear. The Second World War had ended, but its shadow stretched into the decades that followed. For those who lived through it, the war never truly ended. Survivors carried scars on their bodies, in their minds, in their dreams. Veterans spoke of comrades lost. Civilians remembered nights of bombing, the hunger of rationing, the fear of footsteps in the dark. For children born after, the stories shaped their world. History books filled with battles and dates. Monuments rose, ceremonies were held each year, candles lit for the fallen. The memory of the war became part of humanity itself. When we look back, what do we see? We see the ambition of leaders who promised glory and brought ruin. We see the resilience of ordinary people, enduring the unendurable. We see the cruelty of hatred and the strength of hope. The war was disturbing, devastating, and vast. But within it were countless small acts of courage. Someone sharing a crust of bread, someone hiding a neighbor, someone refusing to give in to despair. It reminds us that even in darkness, humanity flickers like a candle, fragile but enduring. And so our story comes to an end. From the shadows before the storm, to the fall of empires, to the uneasy peace that followed, we have walked through the disturbing life of the Second World War. The war is history now, but its lessons remain. Sleep now with the quiet of memory. The war is over, the night is still, and tomorrow will come, as it always does, with the rising sun.